Hi there, my name's Annette, Sunbeam Fabric Art. Today, what I've got for you is another Scrappy project. I'm going to use scraps to transform this plain, boring, free tote bag. It's going to be kind of a challenge, and I'll show you why here in just a second. So you can see here the side of this tote bag is a long rectangle that they actually stitched into the shape. That's not the normal way I do totes. I usually have this as a seam, and then it's open here to make a box seam, which means the bottom is a little bit smaller than the top. It also has these interesting rivets. I don't think I'm going to be able to do much with this area if I want to keep these straps in place. So we'll just see what we're going to do about that. I'm just not sure yet, but here we go. All right, well, you can see here I've got quite a few scraps to choose from. For this project, I'm using those little squares you see at the bottom and the right-hand side. All right, this is a nylon mesh bag, and one thing you want to keep in mind, don't put your iron directly on this type of product. It will melt. But this nylon does make a great strong base or interior layer for a tote bag. Okay, I'm measuring the little rectangle that's on the side of this bag. It was 5 inches wide, so what I'm doing here is making 2.5 inch marks, and I am going to cut right down the middle of this rectangle to open up this bag to the way I like to put a tote bag together. With both sides marked, I then cut with my scissors on the line I drew at 2.5 inches, and then I cut to the left and cut to the right at what was and will be the bottom of the bag. Here you can see the shape that this bag now has as it's opened up. This is the shape that I generally use when I'm making a tote bag. You can customize this bag based on what you're using for recycled material or whatever you need for a bag. Now, I didn't want to use scraps for my lining because it would be hard to match the outside and the inside of the bag. So I found a fabric in my stash. It's kind of a patriotic theme, but it's not one that has really fit into anything that I've wanted to work on. So I thought, okay, this is a great use. I'm going to use this mostly unwanted fabric for the lining of my tote bag. So I'm just kind of cutting it to size, making sure I have enough to cover up this template that is the recycled bag. Now this is slipping a little on my nylon backing, so the first thing I'm going to do is just use the pattern on this lining to sew some straight lines. And here you can see the vertical lines that I stitched to hold this lining to my nylon recycled bag. Now, one cool thing that worked out in my favor is having these vertical lines evenly spaced is going to make it so easy for me to sew my little scraps on and keep them in nice, neat lines. And here is my pile of the scraps that I have chosen to use for this project today. I have a lot of extra squares from this fabric, as well as a few half jelly roll strips. Now this is one of the easiest projects I'm going to do. I'm just going to start putting these squares right sides together, and I'm going to line them up with these stitching lines that just magically appeared when I secured the lining to the nylon bag. I'm going to put 2 of them right sides together, stitch them together, and just finger press them open, and then I'm just going to keep adding squares all the way across the bag. All right, here I'm stitching down row 2, and you can see there's going to be a gap between row 1 and row 2, but I do have a solution for that, and you will see that a little bit later in this video. I'm definitely stopping to trim all the excess threads off the back every time I finish a row. You may have noticed when I laid out my bag, there were flaps on the right and the left side of both sides of the bag. I'm using these half jelly roll strips to cover up the flaps. I stitched down the flap a little closer to the edge of the bag, just so it would not be flopping around on me when I get ready to finish this bag. Let's talk about my solution for covering up the spaces between my rows. I am using a 2.5 inch strip. I'm going to press it in half. I'm going to press each half in half, fold that all together, and then I will have a nice little strip with no raw edges. That strip is going to be top stitched down to the space between my rows, covering it up. The way I am choosing to top stitch these strips down, I'm putting a zigzag stitch on the right side of the strip, and then I'm going to flip it around and I'm going to do the zigzag stitch on the opposite side of the strip. I continued stitching these strips. There were 5 in total, and I think it looks really cute this way. My next step is to square up this bag. The first thing I'm doing is lining up where the box seam is going to be down at the bottom. You can see that those cutouts, those are going to turn into a box seam, and I just did a measurement and it looked like 2.5 inches. So I cut 2.5 inches off the side of the bag. Well, I decided to cut off the top of the bag right below where those rivets were. One of the rivets was actually ripping that nylon fabric, so I just didn't think I could secure this very well, so I'll be adding my own straps. You can pre-measure your straps. In my case, I did not. I started stitching on one side, just eyeballing where it was and how far it was from the box corner. Then I knew I wanted 20 inches for the handle part, and then I just started tacking it down on the other side, as you will see here. As I start this, I'm stitching a blanket stitch on one side of the strap, and I am stopping stitching about 1 inch or 2 before I get to the top of the bag. because I will need this strap to be loose later when I finish the top edge of the bag. I flipped the bag around, and I actually did measure the part of the strap that was going to be the handle, and I made sure that was 20 inches. Then I laid that strap down on the top of the bag on the other side and did the same thing. I did a blanket stitch on one side, and I remembered to leave an opening at the top of the bag for finishing the top of the bag. I cut the length of the strap to match the length of the strap on the opposite side. And when the bag is all done, the last thing we'll do is finish stitching down these straps. Next, with my scrappy side showing, I put the bag together and I stitched those side flaps together with a little bit more than a 1/2 inch seam. I then trimmed bulk very, very close to my stitch line. Next, I turned the bag lining side out, and I repeated the process of sewing these side seams, but I pinched and felt my way to make sure I encased the prior seam in my new seam. Next, I did the same process on my box seams. To create that box seam, you open that seam up, that square, like a popcorn bag almost, and then we're going to stitch a nice big 1/2 inch seam here because you can see I've got a lot of uneven edges. So again, the process is stitch a nice wide seam, trim very close to the stitch line, turn the bag lining side out, stitch that seam again, encasing the prior seam inside the new seam. One cool thing about using this method, it makes the bag reversible. I always like to double check these seams and make sure all the loose edges are caught in the seam and nothing is showing that should not be showing. I looked in my binding stash and I had a roll of this blue batik I'm going to use to bind the top of this bag. This is simply a 2.5 inch wide strip that has been folded and pressed in half. For the beginning of the strip that I'm going to stitch to the lining side of the bag, I like to open it up, I fold down a triangle, then I fold the strip back in half. This creates a little triangle pocket that I'm going to be able to tuck the loose tail end at the very end. When I get all the way around the bag, I'm going to be able to just tuck it right into that little triangle pocket. Now, as you're stitching this binding onto the lining side of the bag, make sure you keep those straps out of the way. We're going to stitch those completely down later, but we don't want to be stitching them to our binding. And as you're going to see when we get all the way around the bag, I stitched too close to my pocket and I had to take my seam ripper and take a few stitches out so I could tuck in my tail end at the end. I'm stitching this binding to the top edge of the bag, the raw edges of the binding at the top, the raw edges of the bag at the top. I had to take out a few stitches here so I would have enough room to tuck in my little tail end. I'm using the angle of that triangle pocket and I'm cutting off that tail end at the same angle with just a little bit extra to tuck into that pocket. I used a few clips to secure that little bit in place and then finished stitching this binding. Once that's done, we're going to be flipping this binding over to the front of the bag with that nice finished edge, and I'm going to use a zigzag stitch to secure it. Now the very last thing we have to do is finish stitching down these straps all the way to the top edge of the bag, and again I'm using that blanket stitch to complete the stitching of the straps. This bag took a total of 3.5 hours start to finish, and here is our finished bag. It's pretty amazing that we took some unwanted yardage, an ugly nylon mesh bag, and some scraps and made this adorable, adorable tote bag. Thanks so much for joining me today for this lovely scrappy tote bag. I hope you had fun, and I hope to see you back again real soon.